Appreciate Rick reading that text for us, and I always know that guys shudder a little bit when they look at those texts I give them and they see million-dollar names in the midst of them, but he handled those well, and I appreciate him willing to do that. Can I give you a quick perspective on what we just read? As you leave the building tonight, how would you like to kneel down and pay respect to King Jake back there? How about King Hunter? That work for you, Scott? Walk back there and kneel down and pay respect to King Hunter as we leave the building tonight. I'm trying to get you to image here as you look around and look at Hunter, and I won't make Hunter and Jake stand up to give you perspective. I won't embarrass them that bad tonight. But that's King Josiah. When he comes into power, when he becomes king over Judah, he's 8 years old. He is the age of Jake back there, of Hunter sitting back there, and maybe others that I'm unfamiliar with their particular ages. I had to ask those, by the way. But can you imagine? Can you imagine such a young boy, no offense, young fellas, being given the awesome responsibility to become the leader of God's people, king over them, and to do it in a superior way to his predecessors? To have done it from such a young age is remarkable within itself just to fulfill the purpose. But to imagine the success and the quality of the leadership that came from him is even more magnificent when you consider that facet of the story of King Josiah. Tonight, if you will, for just a little while, can we learn some lessons from this great king? Though it may seem quite unusual for us to even imagine that someone so young could even potentially be given this kind of responsibility, can we not take a few moments together tonight, examine that text that was just read for us a few moments ago, and a handful of others that help us to appreciate what kind of man he became under the pressures of being the king over God's people. I want you to recognize as we introduce our thoughts together this evening that during this time of departure, if you will, from God, there is yet here one king who decides to be respectful towards him. It wasn't the track record of the people all that much. In fact, there weren't a whole lot of great kings or good kings among God's people over the years. And here's one who steps up in a very young age to fulfill the capacity of not just a king, but a good one. One who understands and respects Jehovah and respects the awesome responsibility it is to lead God's people in God's ways. To actually direct the people to follow the teachings and principles of God, which he himself wasn't necessarily educated in. Which he himself had to kind of re-educate or learn about because it wasn't what was happening among God's people when he takes over. Young King Josiah respects God's Word, and he's a great example for all of us to do the same. And there's lots to be learned from him. When you look at his circumstances and the difficulties that he was under, and his disposition and attitude through it all, and obviously then you look at the very actions of his reign, there's going to be a lot that we can learn in connection to all of these things. I want you to recognize first and foremost those challenges that we're talking about tonight that he encounters. Number one, I want you and I to appreciate that Manasseh, his grandfather, not all that great a guy. That's an understatement, by the way. Go back and let's look at him for a minute. And let's just get a picture here of the kind of King Josiah is, despite the fact that that's not what he was led to be. He was led to be, by example from his predecessors, to not be one who would love God and respect God and honor God. In fact, he had been led to the contrary of that kind of thought. Notice 2 Kings 21, verse 3. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father, speaking of Manasseh, which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He raised up altars for Baal and made a wooden image as Ahab king of Israel had done, and he worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. Stop for a moment. When you speak about this particular king, recognize who it is that he's tied to. He gets tied to Ahab. He gets tied to the sinful practices of his predecessors, ignoring the example of Hezekiah and basically reestablishing all the things that were contrary to God. He does everything he can to bring the people not back into closer relationship with Jehovah, but actually reinvents and rebuilds the very structure that had separated them from God to begin with. Verse 4. He also built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said in Jerusalem, I will put my name. You know, it is one thing for a man to choose that he does not desire to honor God. It's one thing for a man to decide in his own heart that he has no interest in Jehovah, has no interest in what God wants from him. And though I would disagree with his conclusion, at least that's as far as it goes. It's an individualized decision. But here's a man who's determined that not he only is going to go away from Jehovah, but he's doing everything he can to reestablish sinful practices among the people, and even so far as putting false god altars in the house of God, where God said, my name is in Jerusalem. Don't bring forth any other names here. This is my place, where my name should reign supreme. That's how deeply sinful he had become. He built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. Verse 6, also he made his son pass through the fire, practiced soothsaying, used witchcraft, and consulted spiritists and mediums. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Can you imagine a man so deeply entrenched in idolatrous worship that he would put his own son to pass through the fire? That he would allow for his own family members to be subjected to the ritualistic, sinful, idolatrous practices of the pagan world around him. And rather than turning to God for wisdom and counsel, he would rather go to the horoscope of his day. He'd rather go to the soothsayers and the mediums and all of those who practice witchcraft. And he provokes God to anger in the midst of it. He even set a carved image at Asherah that he had made in the house of which the Lord had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. Skip down to verse 16. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood till he had filled, I want you to note this, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides his sin by which he made Judah sin in doing evil in the sight of the Lord. Number one, he has persuaded the people away from righteous behavior and honoring Jehovah above, but he has also chosen to shed innocent blood, so much so that the streets are imagery filled with his blood, of the blood of the innocents that he had robbed them of. That's the place. That's the place where King Josiah has to come from. A place where idolatrous practices were not only accepted, but they were promoted by his grandfather. A background of where even evil, more evil than even the nations that God had destroyed before Israel would ever commit. I want you to notice verse 9 of chapter 21, where the text simply says, but they paid no attention, and Manasseh seduced them to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. His leadership has led them into evil practices that were even deemed by God Himself to be worse than those nations round about them. The nation is deteriorating and deteriorating and deteriorating at the leadership of Josiah's family before at 8 years old he becomes king over God's people. The state and conditions and challenges that surrounded that scene were dreadful. Ammon, Josiah's father, in verse 19 of chapter 21 of 2 Kings, was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 2 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was a big long one. See how I get away with that, Rick? I don't know whether you can get up here and read Scripture and say a big long name, but I just did. The daughter of Heraz of Jorbah. And he did, verse 20, evil in the sight of the Lord as his father Manasseh had done. That simple statement means simply to me that Ammon is just as bad as Manasseh. that they are peas in a pod. They are collectively evil. He has chosen, Ammon has chosen the very same path that Manasseh, his father, had chosen. He is leading the people in the same deteriorated, idolatrous approach that the people had seen for far too long. Josiah's dad's not much better. In fact, he's no better at all. The example that he had set before him is not good. As Ammon follows in Manasseh's ways, and we find later that he's killed by his own servants after 2 years. A man who had become so wrought with wickedness that even his servants couldn't take it any longer. Those that he had surrounded himself were wicked within their own mindset that they would choose to take his life. Which then leads us to Josiah, the 8-year-old king. Now I want you to think about that for a moment. Now we can sit here and talk culturally all day long, and I get some of that. I would readily admit to you that I believe if you're trying to compare our culture to their culture, that most likely younger people in their day were more mature than they are today. That's not a slap in the face to youth today. That's just a simple idea and fact. That because of the nature of their rearing in those days, they would have to, by force, grow up a lot faster than children today have to grow up. But be that as it may, he's still 8 years old. And though he may be a little bit accelerated in terms of having to grow up, he's still 8 years old. And given the responsibilities that 8-year-olds simply don't receive very often. His upbringing, surrounded by administrations who had done what? Who had defiled God's Word. What do you think about that? What kind of men would Manasseh and Ammon had surrounded themselves with? What kind of men, generally speaking, they would have surrounded themselves with men of like mind? By the way, most rulers, most people in positions of power do that. They rarely want a counter argument about their mindset, and so most people in positions of power and authority generally like to surround themselves with individuals who think like they think, who have the same kinds of concepts and ideas. Why is it that regardless of what time period you're talking about or what nation you're talking about, that when a ruler gets into power and he has an ability to be persuasive and influential, and then he begins to build a group of individuals that are also in authority that think like he thinks, then it's pretty easy to persuade the people. Let me suggest to you that Manasseh and Ammon are able to persuade the people because they've surrounded themselves with leaders and put people into positions of authority who thought like they did on idolatry. And all I'm trying to get all of us to understand is that when Josiah at 8 years old becomes king, all he has seen in his short span of life, two-year reign of his father, before he comes into power. I'm not great at math, but that probably means then that he had, 6 years of his grandfather. So in his 8 years of time here, you're talking about his grandfather, then his father, in that short 8 years of span, and he hasn't seen anything but wicked behavior from either one of them and those around them. This isn't going to be easy for him to break that trend. He'd also be confronted by adults who could easily influence him to evil. What do these men who've been in power want to do? They're going to want to remain in power. And they're going to try to influence and persuade. And is it easy to persuade an 8-year-old to do things? I'm not trying to be insulting here, but it is. That's why we have to educate and teach them. And as we raise our children, we warn them, right? Be careful who's influencing you. Be careful who you're friends with at school. Be careful who you listen to at school. Be careful, be careful, be careful. Why? Because we know that people of that age generally are very easily influenced. Josiah wouldn't be any different. And yet he would be confronted with individuals who had challenged him. He was surrounded by other nations like Assyria and Babylon and Egypt, the Moabites and the Arameans. And all these folks were going to want him to follow in the same paths of his predecessors. But that's not what he does. Somehow, some way, and I guess I should say maybe by the very providence and power of God, this young man somehow is able to escape that historical background and is able to take a step forward and say, you know what, what's been lacking in our nation for the last few reigns has been God. And it's time to return respect back to God. Isn't it interesting on one side that it's the 8-year-old that gets that rather than the adults? That's pretty sad, isn't it, when you think about it? That here it is, the 8-year-old gets it, we ought to start respecting God more. And the adults surrounding him are saying, no, we like the altars that we've established in the house of God. We like worshiping idolatry. They're the ones who this information and knowledge should have come from, but it's the 8-year-old new king that has to remind them that it's time for us to honor God again. You know, our children do that today as well. I can't tell you how many times I've heard one of my children say something that I should have thought of, spiritually speaking. They see things from a purity that sometimes I don't see. And here's King Josiah, who sees things far different than what he had seen from others. Now go to that text in 2 Chronicles chapter 34. Now let's go back to that. Let's go back to that text that was read for us a little while ago, and let's look at this man. Now that we understand where he came from, let's talk about he himself and what he had done. Verse 1 illustrates the most unusual part of our account, where he is 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. A long reign. From 8 years old, for 31 years, he rules over God's people. I want you to notice that down in verse 3 that we find that it was at about the age 16 that he very, very vehemently begins to pursue the Lord. Verse 3, for in the 8th year of his reign, so I'm simply doing basic math here, 16 years old roughly, in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, and I appreciate that, because what the implication of that statement is that the writer of the text is trying to emphasize to us that, okay, yeah, he was 8 when he started, and when he begins to really pursue after righteous things and getting the people back right, he is still young. The leadership that he is demonstrating is coming from somebody who was considered, even in their time, young. 16 years old, roughly. As he begins to lead the people, he began to seek the God of his father David. Not his father Ammon, not his grandfather Manasseh. He sought the God of his father David. He points it back to the king who had the heart of God. And in the 12th year he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the wooden images, the carved images, and the molded images. And so basically from 20 years old forward, he gains the respect for God that he needs to have. He wants a heart like King David had, and then he doesn't stop there. He doesn't say, well, I want to be a king who has the heart of David. What he does is he says, I want to demonstrate the heart of David, and I'm going to rid Judah of all things that are contrary to God. I am going to purge the nations just like Hezekiah had done, or tried to do, in order that the people might return. Verse 4, they broke down the altars of the Baals in his presence. Think about that. Here's King Josiah, about 20 years old, and he just doesn't say, hey, you guys right here, go over there and destroy those altars of Baal for me, and I'll be back here eating grapes. What he said was, we're going to go do this, and where does he go? He's standing right there. He's right there with them. Can't you appreciate the spirit of a leader who's standing right there with the people who are doing the work? He's right there with them. He doesn't just send a couple of guys over there to destroy those altars. They destroyed them, the text says, in his presence. And the incense of altars which were above them, he cut down. The wooden images, the carved images, the molded images, he broke in pieces and made dust of them and scattered it on the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. You might think that crude. Let me simply suggest to you, I don't think he's trying to be crude. He's trying to be poignant. He's trying to illustrate to these folks that these are the tools that these folks that are in these graves here, these are the tools that they use to worship in idolatrous ways. And we have burned these things down to dust, and we have illustrated to you visually that we are through with these things, and they belong to those in those graves. Those people were the ones who served in idolatrous ways. And the imagery of that scene where those altars are now pounded down and broken down into dust, and they're scattered across those graves, it shows you that Josiah is serious. He gives a very specific moment in time where you can almost basically say that was the day they were done in his eyes with Baal worship. And that dust scattered across those graves of those who had sacrificed to those altars. Verse 5, he burned the bones of the priests on their altars. Again, what a symbolic imagery you would have. Most likely, if you're burning the bones of those priests, you had to do what to do that? You had to dig them up, or at least pull them from tombs. Josiah isn't satisfied with just saying the words that those priests had misguided the people. He's not satisfied with just simply making a gesture that those priests had led the people in wrong ways. He wants them to have a visual representation of the failure of those who had led them in that idolatrous path, and he brings their bones and upon those altars, burns them and cleanses Judah and Israel. And he's not content to do it just where? He's not content that Jerusalem gets cleansed, but notice, he did in the cities of Manasseh, in Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and all around with axes. And when he had broken down the altars and the wooden images, he had beaten the carved images into powder and cut down all the incense altars throughout all the land of Israel. He returned to Jerusalem. Until the nation had been purged. He continued until the cleansing was fulfilled. But it wasn't enough just to get rid of the bad, was it? We might chalk him up as a great king, a good king, by the simple fact of the matter that he was willing to step out, do that which was unusual, to do that which probably a lot of people resisted, and to do it in such a way that was very bold and direct, to actually crush these things down, scatter them on graves, to burn the bones of those priests. It would be one thing for us to simply acknowledge the fact that he had gone to great lengths and extremes to cleanse Jerusalem of those sinful practices, but he doesn't stop there. Because he recognizes something that all of us need to recognize, that at any time that you purge, when you're talking about spiritual things, you've got to fill the void. I've said this in different ways from this very pulpit, but I remind you tonight that a lot of times where we make mistakes and why we get back into the same habits of sin is we try to purge the sin without filling the void with spiritual things. And so the void becomes, it's there. We purge that sin out, but we don't fill the void with spiritual things, so what gets to come back in? Sinful things get to come back. And so Josiah recognizes that it's one thing for him to get rid of all that idolatry, but if he doesn't give the people perspective again on what to fill the void with, and that is worshiping and honoring God, then he will not have fulfilled the purposes in the right way. So in the 18th year of his reign, at about age 26, when he had purged the land and the temple, he sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, Messiah, the governor of the city, and Joah, the son of Joahaz, the recorder, to repair the house of the Lord his God. Let us get the temple back into worship mode and not to idolatrous gods, but to the God of heaven. It's time to repair the temple and to return the people back to the worship of God. Friends, his respect for God at yet a very young age started, yes, at 8, really comes to fulfillment at age 16. Then he begins to really press the issues at 20. And now at age 26, he is chosen to fill the void and try to return the people back to honoring and worshiping God. I want you to go back now to 2 Kings chapter 22. As we continue to think about this respect for God that he had, I want you to notice something with me that happens in 2 Kings chapter 22 and in verse 8. This is a basic same recording, if you will, of Josiah as we were reading in 2 Chronicles 34, but as it is with the records of the kings, sometimes you get additional information depending on which text you're reading from. In this particular text, in verse 8 of 2 Kings chapter 22, then Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan, the scribe, remember we read that in 2 Chronicles 34, those guys that he had sent back to the temple, get that temple rebuilt, get it reestablished, get it right, get it cleansed. And they said, the scribe says, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And I remember talking about this when we studied 2 Kings, but I want to remind you of something. What has to come prior to being able to find something? It has to be lost, right? You don't find something that you've had all along, right? You find that which was lost. They had lost the book of the law. Maybe it wasn't missing in the sense that they didn't know where it was, so much as it just hadn't been sought after for a long time. It needed to be found. Certainly the idolatrous worship that had been going on there was not going to focus on that law, so the book gets set aside. And Shaphan the scribe says, I found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan and he read it. Good idea, by the way. He found the book of the law and he begins to read. Notice verse 11 of 2 Kings chapter 22. Now it happened, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, that he tore his clothes. He's so grieved and in mourning over the realities. You know what's interesting about this? What that tells me is that Josiah had an ability from other sources to recognize that idolatry wasn't good. We need to purge the land of all of it. We need to cleanse the temple and all the cities away from idolatrous worship. And we need to get the temple back to worshiping and honoring God. And he did all that without any specific reference to the book of the law, because they just now found it. And they find the book and he hears it in his reading when he's 26 after he had sent those men in to reestablish the temple as a place of worship to God. God's presence was still in the land. And undoubtedly there were some who apparently were able to influence Josiah to help him realize what the people really ought to be. And he understood certain principles of right and wrong, even without necessarily being able to directly look at the book before it. What I appreciate about that is God has always kind of had that aspect about Him, that His will and purposes in some ways are understood by the very nature in which He's created us. Created in His image, meant to glorify Him. Any time that I sin or do that which is contrary to the will of God, I am going against my own nature. Any time that I violate the will of God, any time that I do something that is contrary to the purposes of God, I violate my own nature because I am created in the image of God. There was a general understanding, one way or another, that this idolatrous worship was wrong, and they begin to correct it. But it is now that the law was made known that he's even grieved over the fact that they had become so sorrowfully sinful. He tears his clothes. In verse 13, go inquire of the Lord for me, for the people in all of Judah, concerning the words of this book that has been found, for great is the wrath of the Lord that is aroused against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us. Josiah wants to know more. And he wants to be able to educate the people and to let them know what God has declared for them. Verse 19. Because your heart was tender, speaking of him, and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they would become a desolation and a curse, and you tore your clothes and wept before me. I also have heard you, says the Lord. Because you humbled yourself, Ammon your father, Manasseh your grandfather, their arrogance led themselves and others into idolatrous and sinful behaviors. You have chosen respect for me. You've humbled yourself before me, and God says, I'll reward you for that. In fact, God brought peace back to the people for a period of time. Verse 20, surely therefore I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace. And your eyes shall not see all the calamity which I will bring in on this place. So they brought back word to the king. It's an interesting thought. God basically says, my decision is made about the nation. Their pattern of sinful behavior had reached a point that there's no turning back from the decisions that God has made concerning them. But what God has said is that Josiah, even though that is the path we're on, even though that is the choice God has made, even though those are the things that God will do to the nation, because you have humbled yourself, you won't see those things. Because you were willing to lower yourself and exalt me, you were willing to fight against all the challenges that were set before you, and you were willing to honor me, that calamity won't come to you. What that encourages me in is simply this, that even in the midst of very sinful days, God will always honor the humble. God will always lift up those who are willing to lower themselves in His presence. God will always reward the faithful, even when the multitude might be deteriorating. And so peace came to Josiah that the others had not seen. I want you to recognize with me tonight that I tricked you, didn't I? I just bumped the wrong button. That's all. That's all it was. False alarm, but it's not long. But I want you to just note a couple of things. We may have all the kinds of circumstances going against us. Serve God anyway. You may have all kinds of things that you could put on a list that are battling against you. And I'm asking you and I'm asking myself tonight to serve God anyway. Josiah had nothing going for him. He's an 8-year-old boy given the responsibility to lead God's people. He'd had 2 predecessors, a father and a grandfather, that led him in the exact opposite direction that he should have been. His background would say completely that how could you even expect him to do that which is right? But he did. We might have parents that live contrary to the Lord. That's hard. That's hard. Because that's backwards. Right? What do we generally think? We generally think, and we have this image of here's this set of parents, and they were loving, and they were kind, and they were considerate, and they brought their children to Bible study, and they studied the Bible with them, and they encouraged them in righteous behaviors, and the parents did all that they could to try to guide someone in the right path, and that child refused all of that and goes contrary to the will of God anyway. And that's got its own level of sadness about it. But let me suggest to you there's another level of sadness when here is a young person who in their heart, they want to serve the Lord. They want to do that which is right. Then in their heart, they're trying to honor Jehovah, and it's the parents who are the problem. That's Josiah. And that isn't easy. Because we're taught to do what with parents? You're to obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Young people, whether you want to admit it tonight or not, but your parents have a greater influence on you than you realize. Young women, you don't answer this out loud, but think of it in your mind. What moment in your life where you said something or did something or acted in some way and you said, "Oh no, I just became my mother"? Right? It happens, doesn't it? Why? Because that's the influence that was there. And some people, like Josiah, have to fight through a negative influence to be a servant of God in their youth. And I applaud them for it. I pray for them for it. I hurt for them. Because they deserve better from older people. But I'm asking them to fight through it anyway. I'm asking young people who may have parents who aren't guiding them in the way they should to serve the Lord anyway. We might have people who strive to sway us away, like the Gentile world did for Israel and Judah. We may have all kinds of people around us who are trying to tell us to do everything that's contrary to the will of God. And I'm asking you and I'm asking myself tonight to ignore it. And to not let those influences persuade us away from God. We might be young. We may not have years of experience to draw from. But I'm encouraging every person, young and old alike, to serve the Lord. And just like King Josiah, who at a very young age had to step up despite all kinds of challenges and background issues, is a great example of serving the Lord. And so Josiah's circumstances did not subject him to reject God. Josiah's circumstances didn't license him or even persuade him to reject God as others had. And friends like him, we must live before the Lord with a humbled and penitent heart. That despite what others have done or will do, I'll serve the Lord. I'll seek His will and His good favor. I know that peace will come to me if I'll honor Him. That the calamities that others face I can avoid because I'm honoring Him. And I'll do that by respecting His Word. And when His message teaches me, I'll listen. When His message is spoken, I'll hear. I'll observe, I'll honor the will of Jehovah. Young and old alike can learn from King Josiah. Young and old alike can appreciate a man who's willing to step up and serve the Lord. Who respects God despite the surroundings that he was brought up in. Who respects and honors God despite all the influences that surrounded him. A young man who just wants to honor God. And God says, I'll reward you. We may live in the midst of great challenges ourselves at times. We may live among folks who are influencing us into every way possible except that which God would want from us. But I'm encouraging us to ignore those things. Inviting us to respect God's will and to honor it. And live as God would have us to. You may be subject to the gospel tonight. Maybe we could baptize you into Christ for remission of sins. Maybe we could encourage you to appreciate the salvation that's found in Jesus. Maybe you've once done that. Young or old, maybe we once made a decision to serve Him, but we were persuaded by others away from God, and it's time for me to restore myself to Him. If we could pray for you, encourage you, help you in your obedience to the gospel even this hour. We'd ask you to look into your heart and make a decision to humble it and serve God even this hour, won't you come? While we